Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first session of Remote Learning and Science webinars. And this will be, as the title says, an introduction to New Vision's resources that we developed for remote learning. So first, we're just going to go ahead and go through the goals of this webinar and some agreements that we think will be helpful in making it a positive experience for everyone involved. So these are goals. I just want to give you a moment to go ahead and read through them. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the agreements. So these are a list of norms and agreements that, as I mentioned earlier, we think will be really useful in making this a positive and smooth experience for everyone. I invite you to go ahead and read them and consider whether you might use these if you're doing webinars with either colleagues or students in the future. So let's go ahead and do some introductions. I'll go ahead and introduce myself and then allow my colleague and co-host to introduce herself. And then we'll give everybody some time to fill out a poll and tell us a little bit about who they are. So my name is John Salazar. I've been working on New Visions for about 5.5 years now. I work on the science team, developing, mostly focused on earth science support and chemistry support, but I'm involved in biology, or I should say living environment, and other science support as well. Dora, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Dora Castell. I've been at New Visions for about 2.5 years now. I support both earth science as well as the living environment and biology work that we're doing, and have some prior experience with remote learning and developing some online resources and courses for teachers, but this has definitely been a challenging and exciting time as we make the shift to remote learning right now.
Thanks, Dora. So if participants could go ahead and take a moment to fill out the poll so we can all learn a little bit about who we are, what we do, and yeah, just learn about each other in general. Let's actually go ahead and also do a little icebreaker here around what are some of the successes and challenges that you've experienced with remote learning so far. So please take a moment, use the chat window, and share at least one success and one challenge that you've experienced in this new context of instruction. Dora, as people are posting their comments, if you could go ahead and just maybe share some of the things that you're noticing.
Sure. So it looks like some people are noticing the opportunity to engage students in a meaningful way, but the challenge with engagement is also engaging all students, which totally makes sense. I also see some challenges regarding even though students are logging on, to get all students to log on and actually participate in the remote learning platforms that people are using. It does seem like some teachers are actually able to get a lot of work from students, which is very exciting, and teachers are able to post assignments and things are moving along. But it does seem like, yeah, the actual challenge of getting students to log into their accounts frequently is still something people are struggling with a little bit. It does seem like there's a range of different platforms being used, and so that's exciting to see as well.
Awesome. Yeah, great to hear that there are definitely some successes that participants have had so far, and of course, some very real challenges that hopefully we can try to figure out some solutions for together as a community. So let's talk a little bit about approaches to remote learning. And first, we'd like to just start by hearing about what different approaches participants in this webinar have been taking to remote learning. So please take a moment to fill out the next poll, and we'll comment and ask questions if they come up.
So related to this question about Google Classroom, it looks like people are also using Microsoft Teams, Class Dojo, and Schoology, which is interesting to hear about. And those will be platforms that, as you think about how you're going to adapt our resources, how you'll fit those into the various platforms that you're also using.
Great. So before we really get into the instructional model that we are suggesting and some of those resources that are designed according to that instructional model, we want to take some time to just talk about the terminology associated with remote learning. It's something that's new to most of us. And so we want to make sure that when we use certain terms, we're all speaking the same language and understanding each other. So these are three terms that we're going to be using throughout this webinar and subsequent webinars, and you might see in some of our guiding materials or documents: synchronous instruction, asynchronous instruction, and blended instruction. Let's go ahead and define those. So synchronous instruction is where the teaching and learning is happening in real time. So participants or students can join live at a specific time. So it needs to be coordinated so everybody's there online together at the same time. And materials are presented in real time through something like a screen share, like we're doing right now, through videos or presenting slides, like we're also doing right now. And sessions can be recorded to be reviewed at a later time. And that's just in case some students can't join, like Dora, or like was shared earlier in the challenges, that sometimes not all students can join at the same time. So recording sessions could be useful so those students could access presentations in the future. Which leads us to our next term, asynchronous instruction. So this is where students can learn in their own time and their own place. So participants or students will receive materials in the form of readings, videos, websites, and a number of other types of resources. Participants complete the work on their own time, and then they can submit that work by either email or Google Classroom by a given deadline, whatever is agreed upon by the teacher and students or participants that are working together. Next is blended instruction, which, as the term might sound like, is that it's a combination of both synchronous and asynchronous instruction. Videos or readings can be completed before the webinar. Synchronous discussion or presentation of material can take place, and then moderated chat or Q&A about previous previewed materials. So again, I think this depends on what sort of collaboration you're engaging in, but you could think about like what parts of that collaboration or instructional sequence for students make sense to be synchronous and which parts should be asynchronous. And you'll see an example of what that looks like in our materials a little bit later. So just take a moment to review the terms and the short definitions. We also want to share some suggested practices to consider as you're engaging students or colleagues in remote learning. Go ahead and take a moment to read these, and you could certainly access these links through the presentation at a later time and dig a little bit deeper into some of these suggestions. Let's go ahead and talk about the instructional model that the New Vision Science team is using to design our materials for remote learning. As you can see, each one of the instructional sequences or learning plans is going to have a topic, for example, Earth's interior and plate tectonics, and then the course being Earth science, and some sort of overview statement that's just in a concise manner describing what the learning plan is going to be focusing on. And if we look down below, you're going to see that each learning plan is going to have a link to the instructional model, so you can learn a little bit more about that. And then some of the other practice and application materials. And then there'll be a folder of all the documents that are part of this learning plan. Then let's look at the first step in this learning plan, which is the launch. This can be done either in a synchronous manner or setting, or you could do it asynchronously as well. I think we're suggesting, if possible, to do this synchronously. But basically what this involves is the teacher can go ahead and sort of remind students of like where they've actually engaged with this content before. They could perhaps tap into prior knowledge if appropriate. And then they go ahead and tell students the new lens or the new context through which they're going to re-engage and apply prior learning. What we are suggesting is, and you'll see in our materials, is that you have some sort of phenomenon or some sort of real world problem that is driving the entire learning plan. So that could be introduced here. As you could see in the right column, this can be done through video links, through an online text or any other text. And then we've also included a handout if you're for students to do things such as note observations, provide some initial ideas that explain the phenomenon or respond to the problem, and then perhaps also ask some questions about that phenomenon or problem that they could revisit later as they learn throughout this learning plan. The next phase.
I was just going to say, just going to add on to that, it sounds like what you're describing, again, this is not the 5E model that we typically use in our instructional materials when we're doing the face-to-face classroom work, but what you just shared, I can see and hear some parallels to what the engage phase might look like, or what a unit launch might look like, particularly around presenting a phenomenon, like you said, and really trying to get access students' prior knowledge and give them an opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, and just that's totally right, Adora. Thank you for surfacing that. And another thing I think I should clarify, because I don't believe I mentioned it initially, as you can see, it says practice and application materials. These learning plans are really meant not to introduce new content to students, but to re-engage them with previous content so they could practice and apply that previous learning in a new context. So let's go ahead and move to the next phase of the learning plan, which is work time. And this could be a combination of videos, texts, animations that students would engage with. And this is all guided by a student handout, scaffolding the way that they interact with these different resources and start to develop some deeper understanding of some of the concepts that will help them respond to the phenomenon that drives this, or to the problem that's driving this sequence. Oops. Next phase would be the check-in, and I shouldn't really necessarily say next, because this could be happening or should be happening concurrently with the work time, but this is just an opportunity for students to give each other feedback on specific parts that demonstrate key understandings or the overall learning that should have taken place so far, and also for the teacher to provide feedback. And this could be done either synchronously or asynchronously, depending on your context. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after we finish going through this model and an example. And finally is the wrap up. This is after students have received feedback from both their peers and the teacher. They've had an opportunity to revise responses. And the wrap-up is going to provide some additional resources that students can engage with that will set them up to refine their understandings and their ideas so far and come to some closure around making sense of the phenomenon driving the learning plan, or that responding to the problem that's driving this learning plan.
So again, just to reiterate, I know, again, it's not the 5E model, but I do think we are, even though it's still trying to capture some of that same constructivist approach that is built into the 5E model, where during the work time, that's, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that's when students would be engaging in modeling, perhaps, working with data, reading some text, sense making, and that the check-ins and the wrap-up is the opportunity to get that feedback from the teacher, clarify ideas, have more student-to-student sense-making going on, and then chance for iteration and reflection.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dora. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all that. And you said modeling, for example, or using models. Why it might not be like physical models like they might use in the classroom. There are simulations, there are diagrams, there are animations, which all can serve as a model that's appropriate for this remote learning context. So I was saying before, the way that you implement these materials certainly depends on your context, your situation, and your student situation. And what I mean by that is your situation in terms of capacity or comfort level with technology and access to technology. And the same goes for your students as well. They might have a range of comfort level with different types of online learning platforms or use of just technology in general. And they certainly might have a limitation to the access of technology, whether it's just a lack of device or too many people in the house right now trying to be online working and doing schoolwork. So these are some suggestions for how to introduce or contextualize the task set. So that's like the launch that we talked about, supporting and eliciting student thinking throughout that work time. So that involves those check-ins, and then collecting and evaluating student work. Um, Dora, do you have anything else to say about this?
Um, yeah, just to add that we're really trying to be mindful as we develop these resources to make sure that they can be used for a range of, as John said, as you said, capacity and access. So that as we develop things, we make sure that it could be used for synchronous work, but it could also be used if most of your students do not have consistent access. And you'll notice at every level, whether it's low, modest, or high, there's still an opportunity to build in student-to-student collaboration and conversation in some capacity, because we want to make sure we don't lose that important feature of learning.
Great. So go ahead and take a moment to read some more of the details in this diagram here. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at an actual example of one of these learning plans. I'm going to talk through the earth science one since that's the one I'm most familiar with. Just give me a moment to click here and access that.
While John's accessing that, I'll just mention again with that learning plan and that structure that we showed earlier. Even though the example we're going to talk through is earth science, as you'll see, like the living environment example and even the sample COVID-19 resource still follows the same exact format. So there's a consistent format across all of the new materials that we'll be developing for you.
Great, thanks, Dora. So yeah, as this says, this is Earth Science Remote Learning Resource. We are having students practice and apply their understanding of Earth's interior and plate tectonics. But we're having them re-engage with that content through a different lens. In this case, the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is an interesting phenomenon on the planet. And so this launch would consist of the teacher sort of presenting this question about volcanoes like the Ring of Fire, or I should say chains of volcanoes like the Ring of Fire, and having students watch a couple of videos. And in this case, they're being asked to note at least 3 observations in the student handout that's provided and linked over in the right column. The students are asked to share their initial ideas and questions as well about, again, how a chain of volcanoes that's so crazy and really interesting, like the Ring of Fire, would exist. How would it form? And then the teacher will let students know after they've had an opportunity to note their observations, provide their initial ideas and some questions, and the teacher might have students comment on each other's responses. But after that, the teacher could let students know that they're going to have an opportunity to engage with a series of resources and activities that are going to help them better understand how this phenomenon happened. And then I think this is also an opportunity for the teacher to set some expectations around pacing and collaboration, and just letting students know when and how classmates and the teacher are going to be providing feedback on their work. So then comes the work time, and they're in this particular learning plan, it's divided up into two uh, series of activities. So first is what's inside the Earth. So if we're talking about how a volcanic chain forms, as students learned earlier, this has a lot to do with what's going on inside the Earth. So they're going to re-engage with those ideas and apply that understanding. And so in this case, they're looking at a density column video, and the layering of different liquids, as that definitely relates to the way that material is layered within the Earth's interior structure. And then once they've read a text and engaged with a couple other resources, they're going to apply that understanding to Earth's interior structure. So looking at like the common materials that the Earth's interior is composed of, and then making some evidence-based claims using reasoning to basically just make a claim about what is the layering like in Earth's interior. And then the next part is an instructional, or sorry, I should say a series of activities with resources that help students then think about, okay, so we know what the Earth's interior is like. How does that lead to plate movement, and particularly the formation of volcanoes, which is the focus of this learning plan. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just open one of these documents, the student handout for this part that I'm currently talking about, so you can get a sense or just an idea of what these documents are, how they're formatted. So this particular document's divided into a series of parts here. And then there's a driving question: is how does the heat from Earth's core lead to formation of volcanoes and eruptions? Right here, students will be able to click on a video of an animation of convection currents. And then in this box below, which is just a table, students will be able to write their responses, which in this case are being asked to describe the process that's driving plate motion, stemming from the heat in Earth's core. And I should note that students would have their own copy of this. If you do it in Google Classroom, you could easily distribute students to their own, a copy to each student that's their own, and they could go ahead and type in here whatever their response might be. And it's an easy way for you to go and assess work. And so there's a series of different prompts relating here to plate boundaries. There's another link here to click to a resource that they're going to use to respond to some additional prompts. You can see a text here. And then ultimately students are going to actually, in this case, model in the form of a diagram and show how it is that heat from Earth's core leads to the formation of volcanoes. And this would be using things like, it says here in the bullets, there's a criteria for this and for other tasks that you might want to use for assessment. So in this case, it's suggested that students have arrows to indicate motion, and that they annotate to explain the role of temperature and differences in density in this process. Let me go back to the learning plan. I just want to get everybody a sense of what those handouts look like, how they're formatted, and how students might interact with them. And then here's the check-in, which again is not necessarily after all the work time has taken place. Actually, it really should be during the work time. And so this is where students, again, have the opportunity to give each other some feedback. In this case, we're suggesting that they look at two specific parts of the learning plan. And so that is part 3 of student handout 1 and part 4 of student handout 2. And again, each one of those parts has some criteria that you would direct students to focus on as they're giving each other feedback. Another suggestion to support student-to-student discussion or feedback is sharing an example of what helpful feedback looks like. So modeling that and paying close attention to that criteria for completed response. And then you could go ahead and have students, again, give each other feedback, and then the teacher could give them feedback as well at that point. Finally is the wrap up, which in this case It's not asking students to go back and revise previous responses like their model, because they've already done that in after the check-in. But this wrap up is sort of just bringing some closure to this question again, the phenomenon of like how the ring of fire and how it formed. And this is through a video that gets a little bit more into this explanation. Particularly, it gets into the types of plate boundaries found in the ring of fire, so students are able to make connections between that in the previous learning and this learning plan, and ask a couple of additional questions regarding predictions and preparing for volcanic eruptions. So that pretty much takes us through this learning plan. As Dora noted earlier, you could go ahead and explore the other learning plans.
Before
If the,
you before
yeah,
you
go
do this, John, I just had a quick question about about what's the pacing, or how do you envision how long this might take? Like what's the time frame a teacher might use this resource for?
Yes, I think what we envision when we design this, or what we were trying to design for, is about 3 to 4 days of instruction in a regular classroom setting. But because of some of these challenges that we've already surfaced around access to technology and just like all the general challenges involved in this transition to remote learning, we're suggesting that this is appropriate for about a week of instruction, maybe even longer. And of course, so this depends on your context and the expectations that your school has set for instruction. Does that answer your question, Dora?
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to, I think helping teachers think about how they might break this up across their time frame, whatever those constraints are. I know schools have different expectations in terms of time frames and assignments. And so, I know some teachers will need to break it up into a task that's due every couple of days. Other teachers might be able to just share the whole learning plan and all the tasks right up front and say, all of this is due by the end of the week or by the end of next week. And so I just wanted to sort of invite people to think through sort of the way they might break up that particular task, the entire learning plan.
Yeah, and that's a great question and a great transition to our next slide here. So we want to give everybody an opportunity, now that they've had a chance to think about their context and seen an example of one of these learning plans, to think about their context, the degree of access to technology, school expectations, comfort level with technology, and think about how might you implement this resource. We'll give you a little time to do that now. All right, so that is the conclusion of this webinar. We thank everybody for joining us. I hope that you got something out of it. We want to mention before we go that other support that we're offering includes office hours. And so this will be a couple different times. Dora, is this once a week or every 2 weeks that we're doing them?
The best way to find out is to actually click the link in this slide when you open the slides, and to actually just go and look on the calendar. I don't remember how frequently they are, but there are at least 2 different office hours each time we offer them. So if one time doesn't work, we offer it on a different day of the week at a different time. They're usually about an hour long. And again, they are posted in the same calendar that will post the webinars. You can also find the link to office hours. For office hours, you don't need to register the way you had to register for this webinar. Yeah, that they're open periods of time, and you can just ask any questions and have some time one-on-one with some of our team.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I think just opening up that calendar that's on the remote learning website that we have is the best way to figure out when we have those office hours and when we have our next webinars. So we'll be having those about every 2 weeks. Again, look at the calendar and keep your eyes open for those. So yeah, stay tuned for our next resources that we'll be posting and the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for being with us.